I want to thank Brian, and I want to thank everybody who is here for coming this afternoon. Our topic is dangerous ideas on campus, and I'm going to try to stick as closely as I can to the subject. All ideas we're talking about are dangerous in some respects. And it's true from the first bright idea to rub two sticks together to the kind of more recent bright idea to split the atom. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that every idea is an incitement, and he might have added that every idea worth talking about is going to trigger an equal and opposite reaction. I'd note that great ideas are not necessarily good ideas. Great ideas can be bad, they can be evil, they can be offensive. Like great art, great ideas are there to provoke people, incite people, infuriate people, and confront people. That's part of the point, and that's part of what makes them great in the first place. Great ideas are life-changing and even world-changing, but the same can be said of little ideas, the small ideas. So what do we do about free speech? The open expression and discussion of great, provocative, and even dangerous ideas on college campuses, and specifically at USD. It's a dance break. Should students or faculty groups be allowed to invite anybody they want to campus? Conversely, should they be able to veto a speaker who comes to campus who advocates ideas that at least some of our community find offensive? May we invite an explicitly racist white nationalist like Richard Spencer or David Duke to speak, or Hashim Nzinga of the new Black Panthers Party? What about an Islamist who wants to make Al-Andalus great again? Or a Latina who advocates the violent revolution in the American Southwest and the establishment of a new Hispanic nation of Aztlan? How about a professional provocateur like Milo Yiannopoulos, his entire business model depends on manufacturing outrage and turning it into profit? Where should we draw the line? Traditionally, at college campuses, there is no line. Universities are a unique place. They're a safe space for ideas. They're where the free and open exchange of ideas that shape our world can be discussed without limits and without fear. In my view, all of the speakers listed above should be welcome on campus should we decide to invite them. According to liberal political theory, godfather John Stuart Mill, free expression includes the right to say or write things that other people might disagree with or find personally offensive, even hurtful. But we live in unsettled times. It's an unprecedented time of crisis for that traditional liberal consensus favoring the free and full and boisterous discussion of ideas. We seem to be drifting toward a more illiberal society, intolerant and increasingly willing not just to rebut, but to silence speech with which we do not agree. We seem lately as a society to be insecure, immature, thin-skinned, and a little quick to take offense at a perceived slight. Lots of adults, including those at the very top of our government, behave like children, loudly demanding the right to speak out, but refusing to recognize the rights of others to do the same. Like children, they seem incapable of understanding that for the right of free speech to work, it has to be reciprocal. Whatever is driving this crazy train, and thank you, Ozzy Osbourne, we seem to be moving backwards when it comes to tolerating the expression of unpopular and controversial ideas. The illiberal fear and loathing of free speech has lately infiltrated our college campuses. We've seen events at more than a dozen universities across the country in the last year where speakers were duly invited and then blocked from speaking on campus, sometimes violently, by different combinations of students, faculty, administrators, and outside groups. On the right, we have speakers like bell curve author Charles Murray at Middlebury, who was shouted down, and a professor injured. Conservative pundit Ben Shapiro at Wisconsin was barred, and others have been harassed to the point that they could not speak. On the left, Father James Martin, Stephen Colbert's favorite priest, was recently barred from speaking at Catholic University because of his outspoken support for gay rights and a dialogue between the church and LGBT communities. And Nancy Pelosi was just shouted down yesterday, although not at a college campus, by DACA protesters who apparently believe that she is the cause of their problems. This is a deeply disturbing trend for two reasons. Number one, the suppression of free speech on campus is unfortunately a real threat, and it undermines the unique and critical role that universities have played in the United States in promoting the rights of free expression and protecting free speech when it's threatened by government and by illiberal social movements. Second, this has frustrated the university's ability to do its job, teaching students and the public about free inquiry and the universe of ideas. As to the first point, universities have always played a key role in American history in promoting free inquiry, free speech, and free expression from the attempts of those who want to limit those rights, whether it's government or private groups. As the American founders knew firsthand, authoritarian governments inevitably try to restrict free speech rights. The NRA was wrong. The government does not come after our guns, it comes after our ideas. Universities have traditionally been the vanguard of defenders of free expression whenever the government or other social forces have threatened those rights. Throughout American history, there's been a consistent pattern of sustained attacks on the right of free speech. Here are 8 big ones, fast. See if you notice a pattern. The Alien and Sedition Acts during John Adams' administration, Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, and the use of military tribunals to attack critical newspaper editors, the war against organized labor in the 19th and 20th centuries, the suppression of anarchists with the Espionage Act of 1917, the suppression of alleged communists from the Smith Act of 1940 through the Army McCarthy hearings, the war on so-called obscenity from James Joyce to Pornhub, the war on the American Civil Rights Movement, recent attempts to exclude immigrants and refugees from this country based on their religious beliefs and their countries of origin. There's a clear pattern here. There's several clear patterns. One of them is the consistent pattern that the most powerful enemy of free speech, the most powerful enemies of free speech, are those who benefit from the way things are, those who benefit from the status quo. This includes government, the rich, and the powerful. And their main targets, anyone who threatens their privileges and their power. In each case, opposition to government overreach came from American universities, whether from students, professors, or those who were educated at universities about their rights as citizens and as human beings. The opposition has not always been organized, effective, or selfless, but even at the worst of times, American universities have remained islands of free inquiry in a crazy world. Who has benefited the most from free speech rights? This includes, in particular, vulnerable minorities of all stripes who lack the numbers to change the country at the ballot box, those who need alternative ways to protect themselves and challenge established power. Historically, the greatest beneficiaries of free speech rights have been racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, artists, labor unions, women, and college students, not necessarily in that order. These are the groups that have made most progress by exercising their power to speak truth to power. And how do you speak truth to power if you can't speak? Our universities have long been among the greatest proponents and defenders of free thought and free speech, and this is why government and the rich and powerful and other illiberal critics periodically seek to undermine the universities in doing their jobs, to undermine the freedom and independence that we have traditionally enjoyed. It's no secret that most political attacks on American universities come from the political right, and there's a reason for it. According to a Pew study done just this year, 58% of Americans who lean toward conservative believe that American colleges and universities are a negative force in American life. We don't score quite as badly as the media, but we are apparently way worse than banks and labor unions and churches and other institutions. It's no secret who is promoting this idea and why, but the conservative critique of American universities is long-standing, it's predictable, and it's worrying, but it's not existential. What is unprecedented about our current situation, and what makes our current situation much more tenuous and much more dangerous, is a more recent trend. It has lately become fashionable on the political left to try to censor and suppress free speech on our college campuses. That is a new phenomenon. And ironically, some of the groups who have benefited the most from free and uninhibited speech and free expression are now among the most vocal critics of those rights. This means that our universities and our institutional attachment to free thought, free speech, and free inquiry are increasingly under attack from all sides. That is a worrisome escalation of the war on ideas. In the 1960s, American students fought for their right for free speech. They often fought against the wishes of the establishment and campus administrators. Today, students at Berkeley and at other college campuses are fighting against free speech, often against the wishes of the establishment and campus administrators. Political life on some of our college campuses has been turned upside down. Students, and faculty for that matter, are increasingly prone to flip out when controversial speakers with whom they disagree are invited to campus. It's no longer considered everywhere sufficient simply to ignore, rebut, or respectfully protest. The tactic du jour is to prevent them from speaking at all. Fortunately, USD has so far been exempt from this. We have stayed mostly in the eye of this particular hurricane, and I hope we continue to do that. But we shouldn't be complacent because it's never too late to panic and join the stampede. So, how should we deal with objectionable and even dangerous speech? This isn't an easy question to answer, and this question itself opens up 100 more questions and 100 more possible answers. Who can come to campus and who can't? What are the rules? Are the rules neutral, or do they favor some speakers over others? What happens if some, or even a majority, of our students or faculty or administrators object to certain speakers? Is there a difference when the general public is invited versus just the campus community? And maybe most practically, who pays for all of this? Berkeley just paid $600,000 for security for one mildly controversial speaker. That is not a sustainable model. So, what are we going to do? I'll leave it to the administrators. Traditionally at USD, the rough formula has been to try to strike a balance among speakers. In the past, the biggest hot button on campus has traditionally been abortion. We don't always handle this issue very well here in practice, but the theory is pretty clear. Pro-life and pro-choice speakers are both welcome to appear on campus, but there has to be a rough balance between those views. The idea is that dangerous ideas are only unacceptably dangerous when you're only getting one side of the story. That seems like a fairly reasonable approach to me, although as I've said, it doesn't always work so well in practice. The world, however, is more complex these days, and I suspect that going forward, we're going to have trouble wrestling with controversial speakers that other campuses are dealing with regarding race, immigration, Israel, Islamism, sexual identity, and a host of other issues. The suppression of controversial ideas on campus, however, doesn't just involve guest speakers. It also involves our classrooms, our dorms, and the campus quad. There is some support in some quarters for the idea that students need special safe spaces and trigger warnings on campus if controversial topics might pop up. Again, it's a reasonable argument. It's one that I don't agree with. And happily, USD has not yet gone down this particular rabbit hole. It's a good thing in my book because trigger alert, dangerous, objectionable, and potentially offensive ideas pop up in my classes almost every day, and that's true for a lot of other classes on campus. And I'm happy to add that, at least so far, it has never been a problem. Our students, I think, on the whole, do better than our faculty in dealing with all sorts of wild, crazy, and even offensive ideas in class. Our students that I have seen don't seem to feel the need for special safe spaces or trigger warnings, and I couldn't be happier about that. And because here is the deal. College itself is your safe space. It's our safe space. It's where we're protected from the possible consequences of examining, judging, criticizing, advocating, and opposing all sorts of weird, stupid, crazy, and dangerous ideas. College allows us to explore all of these ideas without the fear of real-world consequences. But be clear, the principle of academic freedom exists primarily to protect ideas from us. It doesn't exist to protect us from ideas. We can't have free and unfettered classroom discussions about controversial and even taboo subjects. If we can't do that, we might as well fold our tents, because that is what we do. That's our job. You don't come to college to confirm what you already believe. You come to college to challenge what you already believe and to learn from multiple, different, and even radical perspectives that are different from the ones that you're used to and grew up with. Learning about these new, wild ideas is how we learn to separate the good, great ideas from the bad, great ideas. And this is how we become educated, aware, and effective global citizens. I'm going to close with a bit of advice for those occasions, and they will pop up, when you are faced with a speaker on campus that you simply cannot abide, and you feel that you cannot remain silent, and you must oppose not just the message, but the messenger. And that's your right. Here's my cheap advice. Protesting is easy. Taking effective political action is tougher than it looks. I want to close with a paraphrase from Barney Frank. If you care deeply about a cause, and you are engaged in an activity on behalf of that cause that is great fun and makes you feel good and warm and enthusiastic, you're not helping. Because you're just out there with your friends, and political work is much tougher than that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that I feel really honored to be on the same panel with Dean Norton and Dr. Dickson. My job today is to talk about dangerous ideas in China, a topic that seems to be so remote to what Dr. Dickson just talked about, but also intimately connected, I think. In some ways, the definition of dangerous ideas in China is much simpler, disturbingly so. So I've divided up the presentation into roughly 4 segments. I'm going to talk about what constitutes dangerous ideas and what the government has been doing about them, and how the public, young people in particular, college-age students, have found ways, in a tech-savvy world, to navigate, to detour around the means of control, all these different mechanisms in place, to find ways to articulate their opinions to the extent of sort of the freedom of speech that they may be able to have. And also, lastly, I want to kind of just make a couple points about the complexities of the Chinese experience. And then there are some paradoxes that we probably should be mindful of. So with that in mind, I've have a couple of slides here just because there are a few Chinese words that may be interesting for you guys to know how they're spelled later on in next page. So what are considered as dangerous ideas in China? It's simple, it's easy. Like I said, it's pretty disturbingly so. And that is anything, especially publicly articulated opinions that challenge the supremacy of the one-party system and the power of the government. So it's as simple as that. And translated into, campus culture, we're talking about any kind of foreign values, primarily Western values, that are designed to promote liberal thinking. And especially, on college campuses that are also defined as the ideological battleground for power struggle in some ways. And also, controversial academic topics, like, for instance, anything that's revisionistic in nature. Some of you may know this already. In the 1920s, all throughout to the 1940s, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party were locked in a deadly power struggle, complicated by Japan's invasion. And so in recent years, there's been a growing body of revisionist literature arguing that, the nationalist troops actually had to bear the brunt of sacrifice. They're the ones who combated the Japanese invasion, and they're the ones who lost predominantly, a lot of manpower. In comparison, the Chinese communist troops were somewhere in the remote rural areas, and as a result, they didn't really have to lose all that much manpower. So that's considered really subversive. And as a result, that's been kind of shut down. And because it dilutes the power of communism or the communist government. So that's a no-no, that's not okay. Another example would perhaps be somewhat revisionist interpretations of the legacies of 19th century in Western imperialism. Nobody really has glorified Western imperialism, but some scholars in recent years have pointed out, well, you know what, if you look at the girls' schools that were founded by Western missionaries, if you look at the eye clinics and the hospitals, so maybe, just maybe, the legacy of Western imperialism in the 19th century was somewhat mixed, and that's considered a no-no now. I think it's worth mentioning that in terms of freedom of speech or how dangerous ideas are, China has come a long way. I think it's worth noting. Compared to the heyday of Maoism, the 60s and 70s were, when I grew up in China, when you couldn't even whisper among family members because the slightest hint of a dissenting voice could easily land you in a labor camp or worse yet, in jail. And it's not quite that at all. I have to say China has come a long way in that regard, but it's still, the last couple of years, I think the political control has actually sadly and regrettably tightened, and much to the chagrin and the amazement of academics, really. So, and also there are other things like, aside from controversial academic topics, if you're openly demanding, for instance, officials to release information on their personal wealth or their assets, that's considered pretty dangerous. Even though the government itself in the last few years has been sponsoring this massive anti-corruption campaign, but there's a fine difference between sponsored populism and spontaneous populism. Okay, so next one, I want to talk a little bit about what has been done about these so-called dangerous ideas. First and foremost, and that's probably self-explanatory, is constant periodic issuance and reissuance of rules and regulations. Okay, so people are constantly reminded of what's not to be said, what's not to be articulated. Earlier this year, in February 2019, the Minister of Education came up and issued a 10-point rules, and just basically saying, again, there's no room for foreign values on college campuses, and stop doing that. And as recently as 2 weeks ago, the government issued another 10-point of rules and regulations, reminding people who are on WeChat. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next segment. And it's a Chinese version of social media. It's an all-encompassing social media. Some of you may be familiar with that, in fact. So, and there are new rules governing the nature of postings on WeChat. And all of a sudden, I myself, I belong to several WeChat groups, and all of a sudden I get all these reminders from the organizers, from each one of them saying, well, we've got to be mindful of this. In other words, anything that challenges, again, going back to what I said early on, challenges the one-party system and the supremacy of the government, the current existing apparatus is wrong. Anything that advocates constitutionalism, for instance, and separations of power, three branches of government, independence of the judicial system, both online and in the classroom on college campuses are not a good idea, so stay away from them. This is basically, I'm paraphrasing the rules, this is basically what they're telling people. So, and another one is pressure on university administrators and faculty. Just say, you got to toe the line. And now in the last year or so, reportedly 80% of awards for projects, in social sciences and humanities in particular, awarded to researchers who are willing to toe the line, to be conformists. And so that's very, very unsettling, to say the least. And they are, on some college campuses, reportedly, there are students who are essentially planted in the classrooms of liberal-leaning faculty, and these are the students who would tape your lectures and report back to authorities. It's not as prevalent as it's believed to be, but nonetheless, it has happened on some college campuses. So that's another pretty effective means of coming down on free speech, to the extent that people can have free speech. And then the use of official and semi-official news outlets, government mouthpieces like China Daily and Global Times and CCTV, and these newspapers or media outlets to really kind of set the tone and channel public sentiment, peddle a whole heavy dosage of nationalism and populism and this and that, but at the same time, sort of, channel public opinion. So that's another commonly used means of control. And something that's probably interesting, you may or may not have heard about this whole internet water army. Anybody who has heard about that term? And most people may have heard about the Great Firewall, sort of play on the Great Wall, right? So that basically is massive and excessive internet control. So when you're in China, chances are you probably can legitimately access external information, right? But there are ways of going around that. I'll say a few words about that in a second. So, but the internet water army is an interesting phenomena. But now, in light of trolls and the Russian, the game that they've been playing with the elections here, it may not be as unique as people think it is. And water army is a Chinese reference to, or words to describe the Navy or the Marines. So in other words, these are an army of people, like reportedly 30,000 plus of them, who are hired by different levels of the governments to flood the internet with blogs, with opinions, with posts, and with all sorts of writings that are that are favorable to the government's version of events and rhetoric. That basically they're trolls, to use a more contemporary word. So, and there's another term for that, derogatorily labeled, by people who are very, very much against the water army, and they're called the 50 cents party. In other words, these are the people who are paid probably 50 cents per post. We don't know if that's really true or not, but again, it's a common phrase that's used to describe the trolls online. So there's that, and there's also a periodic crackdown of internet cafes. And China now has more internet users than any other country in the world, including the United States, just because it's huge demographic and population base. So to that extent, it's not really surprising. And there are really tens of millions of internet cafes all across the country. So sometimes they're just periodically closed down, on whatever pretext. Okay. So let's see here. Okay, here we go. All right. So the next one, I'm going to talk a little bit about the so-called battle for cyberspace. The tech-savvy young people have a way of going around these means of control. And what they have been doing, and you probably, the young people here in the room, probably know more than I do about this. Well, first of all, the youth culture has been globalized. If you go to China, chances are, in terms of the level of addiction to the internet, it's no less than it is anywhere else. People are just, playing games or reading, and everywhere you go, you see phenomena like that. So the prevalence of WeChat and Youku and Baidu, in some ways, has served as alternatives for the Chinese young people to vent. to articulate their opinions, to do business, and so it serves multiple purposes. WeChat, I wish I could show you. So I've connected through WeChat with my elementary school friends, with college friends. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. And again, that's where people post all sorts of things, satire, black humor, and revisionist historical literature that are very critical of the government's version of things. And guess what? To prepare for this presentation, I did a little bit of research. I wanted to save some of the really meaningful pieces for me. And guess what? The last few days I was combing through the things I've saved. A lot of them have mysteriously disappeared. Blank page. I'm thinking, okay, I guess that's my point. One of the points I'm trying to make. So there's that. And so Youku is a Chinese. Backpedal for a second. So WeChat is sort of an all-encompassing device that serves the purpose of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all that. Youku is a Chinese version of YouTube. So you can't access YouTube, but Youku is fine, and lots of media clips and all that. And Baidu is really sort of the Chinese version of Google. You can type in Chinese characters, you can basically find a lot of information. And you're probably familiar with the use of VPNs and the fake IDs. When you register as an internet user, you have to register with your real name and real ID. But guess what? People go around it all the time. They create their fake IDs and quite effectively. I don't know how they do it, but they do, especially, again, among college students. And another common way of detouring, going around the internet control or the firewall would be the VPNs. And lots of people do it, especially people who know a thing or two about how to navigate the internet world. And when you do have, especially if you're willing to pay, it's not that expensive, but if you're willing to pay for a good, effective version of VPN, you can just do it anything. Last summer, for instance, I was sitting in my mother's tiny little apartment. I could read New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and CNN, and I could confession. I could shop on Macy's website, much to the dismay of my husband, who found packages in our front porch. He said, "You're away. How did these things appear?" So anyway, just to give you an idea as to how doable it is. Okay. And another thing, and it's kind of interesting to say the least, is people have got used to the use of manipulated characters and numbers. I'll give you a couple examples here. June 4th, that's a date in 1989 that marked the Tiananmen Square incident. Many of you know, some may not. So that's when the government cracked down on pro-democracy students and killing. Nobody really knows for sure how many students were really killed, but nonetheless, it was a tragedy. It was a very much of a bloody event in Chinese history. And so you can't really type in June 4th. And people are so creative. They would write in May 35th. There's no May 35th, but somehow it's understood. It's commonly understood on the internet, at least among people who communicate. Oh, that's in reference to the June 4th incident. And Wang Qishan is President Xi Jinping's right-hand man, who for the last few years has been charged for this anti-official corruption campaign, and reportedly, 100,000 corrupted officials have been exposed at all different levels. But guess what? Sometimes it's too sensitive to type in his name. So Qi sounds exactly like 7 in Chinese, and Shan sort of sounds like 3. So guess what? People use 7 and 3, and sometimes they talk about President Xi. And they use words something like steamed dumplings, all because a number of years ago he visited this steamed dumplings restaurants. So, but somehow all the netizens understand what that meant. Last but not least, would be a couple of things that I kind of want to point out is things are complicated. This is something that the Chinese would say when they can't really explain things very clearly or very in a short version. So I'm just going to borrow that. Things are complicated. There are lots of paradoxes in China, among which is, things may not seem to be, it may not be what they seem. So oftentimes, especially outside of China, there's a perception that the central leadership is ironclad. It's not. And the Central Committee, the Politburo, is in some ways a self-balancing mechanism. It has to represent regional interests and the liberals and some conservatives, which is reflected in this ideological power struggle. In the level of freedom of speech is also reflected in the loosening up and cracking down, and periodically, and largely that has something to do with the intra-party factional power struggle. So another one is I want to point out is probably the characteristics of China's middle class. I think probably contrary to conventional political science theories, correct me if I'm wrong, I have two political scientist colleagues here, and that is when a country produces a sizable enough middle class, members of the middle class tend to demand more political participation, a bigger political say. So far, that hasn't really effectively happened in China. I mean, to some extent it has, but not as widespread as people would sort of hope it to be. I think that has a couple reasons. One is the collective culture DNA of China is such, I mean, I think rooted in the thousands of years of Confucianism that attaches a great deal of importance to social harmony, social stability, political order, reverence to the authorities, and so on and so forth. Don't rock the boat, be moderate, be polite, be this and that. I think it has something to do with that, and perhaps equally important, if not more so, is members of the middle class, the entrepreneurs, or even the intellectuals, the academics. They have been primarily the beneficiaries of economic modernization, so they don't really necessarily want to rock the boat. So there hasn't been a widespread clamoring for, for instance, free elections and bigger, broader political participation. So that's kind of worth noting. Another thing is, very quickly, is information has been a two-way street. In some ways, the demand for more political opening up, or for more freedom of speech even, has been sort of muted by the fact that, this is paradoxical, right? The young people are really wanting, and they're eager to access the outside world, and many of them do, and some of them have been abroad. But guess what? Once they do, they kind of catch a glimpse of the flaws, of the shortcomings of the outside, societies, the partisanship, the bickering, and the ineffective, the dated infrastructure, and the guns and violence and all that. And I thought, well, maybe the censorship with all the cameras, maybe it's not all that bad. It enables the police to solve a crime a little bit more easily. So I think there's a lot of haziness in that regard. Lastly, the point I'm trying to make, that the people so far, in my opinion, have been keeping a pretty interesting but precarious balance between venting and resisting. Venting is okay, resisting is not. You can talk among your trusted people, colleagues and friends and family members. You can complain, you can vent all you want. But there's a fine line between venting and resisting. As long as you don't cross the line, you're okay, and the government tolerates that. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
It's complicated. That's how I'm going to start. Dell and Yi both show us today the dangers that we face when we start to tinker with free speech, especially if we think about some of the whiners that Dell talks about taking hold and turning us into something that Yi has described over a period of time. I'm just not sure it's going to happen here. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this broadly. As campuses, we are challenged with free speech issues every single day. And let's just say this out loud because I know it's kind of an elephant in the room. Right now, we're dealing with this at USD. We have an op-ed that was authored by a USD law professor about the values of the 1950s and 60s culture. It was in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And there's a swirl of controversy about that. It was actually in the Wall Street Journal this morning. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to say these issues are always swirling around college campuses every single day. We as faculty and administrators and students, and I know we have all of you in the room here, we negotiate acceptable approaches to inclusion, participation, free inquiry, and free speech inside and outside of our classrooms, in the public squares, in our new public square down the road. This is business as usual for a university. It's true, and I agree with Del wholeheartedly. In fact, I'll take it one step further. We live by the motto, adopted in 1663 by the Royal Society in London for improving natural knowledge, that they wrote this motto, nullis in verba, take nobody's word for it, nobody tells us how to think, kind of a belligerent stance. But that was written in a period when we were moving from universities that served as indoctrinators to universities that served as places of learning. So we do this, we think this, we act this is our job. No argument there. We wouldn't be a university if we weren't embroiled in these kinds of questions and concerns and deep tensions that we have been for centuries. And especially in the 20th century, in the 1950s, all the arguments about whether communists should be able to speak, how they should speak, whether they should even be able to meet. In the 60s, campuses were embroiled in anti-war expressions. In the 80s, we haven't even talked about that one. In the 80s, we were dealing with what private investments would be, what investments would universities deal with, or the nuclear freeze issues. Those led to controversies that universities had to deal with. And I agree with Del and Yee up until this point. But I also think that universities figure it out most of the time, that a majority of these free speech issues are resolved at most colleges most of the time with fruitful, sometimes intense, but usually peaceful debates. So it's only within the last 2 years, and primarily within the last year, that a small number of these controversies have become a bit more intensely antagonistic. So they hit the national news. They make it feel like we're in a downward spiral or a cultural war, where we're pitting the value of freedom of expression against those who value diversity and inclusion. So I truly believe that these tensions, the freedom of expression tensions and with inclusive freedom, are not necessarily inevitable, and that we are creating or structuring a false dichotomy here, especially in a country like the United States that has some pretty hardy free speech protections in place. So by the time we finish today, I want to provide some solutions for ways that campuses can protect free speech, but also enhance inclusion without us having to say that this tension is going to lead us to rack and ruin and spiral us into a hole. So one of the ways to alleviate the tensions is for those of us, and I'm one of them, who have been adamant about freedom of expression, to take a moment and to understand those who feel very strongly about the free speech argument, who are actually concerned about a free speech argument, who see a free speech argument as just a tool of oppression, one of the master's tools, that they see it as a way to, under the guise of the Supreme Court, dismiss women as domestic servants, to argue that racial minorities are intellectually inferior, or to see gay people as mentally ill. It's just a way to keep the status quo. I can completely understand why U.S. free speech laws feels oppressive and frustrating sometimes rather than liberating. I don't see the groups as whiners or babies or snowflakes. I can understand why students at Middlebury College protested the presence of Charles Murray that Del brought up, because they're worried that this conversation about racial inequity with intelligence changes the way people perceive. Just a little seed is planted, and if you walk around campus, you might not feel as smart compared to your colleagues if this is a dialogue that's going on campus. Yale students screamed at some faculty members because they didn't feel that they had a safe space in their residence hall, because a memo from a faculty member dismissed their concerns about cultural appropriation of costumes. Berkeley students erupted in the protest that, again, Dr. Dickson talked about these. Berkeley students erupted in protests prior to the Milo Yiannopoulos speech because they couldn't see any value to kind of the hate mongering that Mr. Yiannopoulos deals in. And then the University of Missouri football team went on strike. I understand this too, because there were some concerns about the university's response to the issues that were going on in Ferguson in 2015. Closer to home, I'll just throw this. I mean, I actually feel this argument every day, and I hear it when I talk to my daughter on the phone, and I say to her, I can't believe that free speech isn't important. And she just, I think, what did I raise? How did I raise this person that can't understand that if you don't protect free speech in the way Dell said, that I've made a huge, horrendous mistake and society's going to fall to pieces. And I have a colleague of mine who has a daughter who is this is like last night we had this conversation. She's majoring in theater. A playwright wrote a play that was given an award. I might not get this all right, but a playwright was written a play that was given an award. The award means that the students have to produce the play, and they have to do it as part of their major. And they can't graduate unless they do this. The students are not excited, they are opposed to the play, but it's been awarded. And the faculty have said that this is okay. They're supposed to be producing it. So they find the play offensive, and they have to decide, this was last night, they have to decide what to do. And they want to refuse to participate, they want to change their major, and they don't want to hear lectures about free speech. I can't repeat what's in the play, but it is titled Buyer Beware by Michael Weller, and he kind of makes light of comedians like Lenny Bruce using a lot of his words, but the students aren't familiar with those particular words and the approach. So, but in the words of, and this is a wonderful book, by the way, Free Speech on Campus by Erwin Chemerinsky and Howard Gilman, he says, free speech advocates must acknowledge the admirable values that tempt people towards censorship, and instead provide a roadmap for addressing these issues in a way that does not undermine higher education's commitment to freedom of speech and expression. So let's look at what's different today from the way it was when the free speech protections were put in. What is our responsibility to create inclusive communities where students feel protected and able to express themselves without being mocked, called snowflakes, but still protecting free speech? I'm just repeating Chemerinsky's argument. So if to understand the students, let's look at who they are, what their background is, and I'm going to do this briefly, and then I'll conclude with what we can use as alternatives. We have a more diverse campus than most of us who are, not the students, but more diverse campuses exist for those of us, compared to the campuses that those of us who are faculty and administrators had. Today's campuses include large numbers of people who come, women, that's new to the college campus. I mean, in the last 60 years, that's just when some of the last colleges were turned from, male-only colleges. So women, underrepresented students to first-generation students. USD now has 39% of students who are considered underrepresented minorities, but and so that's very different for USD. It's very different for colleges in general. We have to remember this. So universities have grown from serving a small portion of the population to serving an engine of social mobility. So when you have this many different types of people on campus who are there and now can testify to the harms that are associated with hateful or intolerant speech on a day-to-day basis, who can identify what they see as microaggressions or sexual harassment, things are going to be different. The conversation is going to be different. And also the internet makes things different. We now have, in social media, we now have an internet that can just blast out junk to wide varieties of people, where speech is not just contained out there in the public square or you're here in this room. All of you, of course, know about Yik Yak and how things can just spread everywhere. So our students are dealing with a more a diverse world, a world where the word gets out more quickly, and we have to be thinking about this. Another thing, and I keep forgetting this, is that we have a group of students who are attuned to the issue of bullying. Our students actually associate free speech with bullying or shaming, not with anti-authoritarianism. Our students grew up with after Columbine, the anti-bullying campaigns were huge in the 1990s. I bet all of you had those kind of conversations. I never had an anti-bullying. I had to avoid the bullies. But there was never a conversation about it. Also, most students were part of self-esteem programs. I know California had a self-esteem program, making sure that individuals felt cared for. I didn't have a self-esteem program, but all these students, they have. So and also we trained them in civil rights issues, women's rights issues, gay rights issues since birth. So we have students who extend the language of harm and threat to apply to not just the traditional examples of hate speech, but to expressions of ideas that are contrary to their very strongly held beliefs of what social justice means. Their definition of what is harmful is very different from what the Supreme Court determines as harmful. So this failure to understand our students' impulses it fails to reflect the laudable compassion that motivates them. Here's one more piece, though, that I'm going to throw out. Free speech arguments are also abstract to our students today. I don't know if the students in here agree or don't agree, but they're not abstract anymore since you got the speeches. But they grew up at a time when the act of punishing speech was what they didn't grow up in a time when the act of punishing speech was associated with undermining social justice, when you were undermining labor unions, women, blacks, anti-war activists. You weren't trying to silence those voices. First Amendment rights are now secure in the U.S., and they have been fairly seriously secure since the 1960s, and there's a set of cases in the 1990s, and correct me if I'm wrong, Del, that completely limit how you define harm, group libel, what fighting words are, cross-burning's even okay in certain situations. So the Supreme Court protects at almost all levels speech that is not an immediate threat. So students grew up with this understanding that free speech is deeply protected. So now we've got Yale University has a report, UCLA has a report that says 72% of students will support disciplinary action against any student or faculty member on campus who use language that's considered racist, sexist, or homophobic. And this is coming from, again, a place where students should be commended, but it's also coming from a place where students aren't worried about those rights going away. It's too, again, I'm repeating myself, but too abstract. There's one example that I'll just throw out there. In the University of Oklahoma, I don't know if you remember this case, there were some guys on a bus singing a really disgusting racist song, and they were expelled from the university. And so students who were surveyed and asked, is expulsion the right thing to do? They argue no. They argue yes. They side with the university for the first time, that full expulsion for singing a song one time. Now the Supreme Court would not uphold that for 1 second because there's no immediate threat. There's no, the group libel, the harassment didn't occur because it was only for 1 second. Could you see that if they, no, yeah, it wouldn't hold up. So Dr. Dickson's and Dr. Sun have outlined why limiting free speech, though, is not a good idea. I couldn't agree with them more. I also think that limiting free speech is going to get you in trouble because it's going to backfire. Who do you think is being stopped from speaking on campuses? Del brought up, and I keep calling you either Dr. Dickson or Del, depends on how I'm feeling at that very second. But we have Father Martin, who wants to talk about gay rights at Catholic University, and we have Chelsea Manning, who was going to speak at Harvard. And these are people who are advocating gay rights, transgendered rights, in different levels. They're also being stopped from speaking, so it backfires. And also, anytime a code of speech that is passed at a university campus and then challenged at the Supreme Court level. Anytime that happens, it has not been upheld by the Supreme Court. So I actually think that limiting free speech is going to be a waste of your time at many levels, and it is dangerous as well. So don't get me wrong there. So what are the solutions to paying attention to a new group of students who really are trying to make a difference in the way we function as a campus? Well, first of all, applaud them for having this conversation and challenging us to have this conversation right here where they should be having it. But the suggestions that are outlined, actually, when I look at the list, I have to commend our student affairs group. We do a lot of this already here at USD. But these two books, Free Speech on Campus, but they both have the same title, Free Speech on Campus. I don't know how that happens. But both of them protect speech completely and totally. But they also say, let's not be stinkers and say safe spaces aren't important. That's where I said I disagree with you. That you do need to have a safe space, maybe a Black Student Association or a women's center, where people can go to organize and to think after there are some protests, or after there's a speaker who comes on campus who makes you feel threatened or harmed. So safe spaces is an easy concession. Another one, they don't necessarily want to see trigger warnings imposed as mandates, but they suggest that all faculty be trained on how you might plan ahead to deal with a controversial topic. Don't just jump in and throw it out in the class without thinking ahead. You know, I've got a diverse group of students out here, so some training with faculty might be a good plan. They say, I like this one, I don't know how any other administrators in the room will like this one, but let's stop the civility campaigns. Maybe we need to have campuses where there's crying and yelling and hand-wringing to let those voices be heard. So go ahead, have the protests, have the free speech, and pay $600,000 to keep it protected. But think carefully about the way you stop protesters from expressing their disdain for the speakers. You can't limit microaggressions, but have sensitivity discussions about microaggressions. Make sure that all student groups are funded and are eligible for funding. Maybe you can't restrict the speech, but you can impose time, place, and manner restrictions. And here's the last one I'll end with, because this is a difficult one. You can expect administrators to speak out against especially egregious speech and acts. We've had Nazi symbols here on campus, and you've seen the president speak out against that. So we need to make sure that the university does stand up and say, we don't appreciate this particular approach. Chemerinsky says that, and Gilman, they say that you can't do that. Presidents do need to speak out, but you have to start thinking about how often they speak out. Is it every time there's a hate speech issue, or how do you deal with this? Maybe this is something that I throw out to the audience at this point and say, I'm done talking, and because you only have 25 minutes to ask questions. But I guess I don't really disagree with you. I just think we need to pay attention to inclusion and diversity and not be so afraid of it. Yeah. Not that, afraid of.
I was sorry.
No, I didn't. You weren't. I meant be afraid of some of the techniques to protect it.
Yeah.
Matt. Oh, by the way, I'm in charge of moderating, just calling on people, but I'm sure the questions will be for everybody.
Yeah. So this question is for anybody who wants to address it. I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to the relationship between the norm of academic freedom and the norm of free speech, because it seems to me that those are lumped together quite often in popular discourse, but they're actually rather distinct, right? So academic freedom is a norm that emerged specifically in universities in relation to the special mission of the university and society, whereas free speech seems to me something much broader and much less tied to the university. So have you thought about how these ideas are connected?
Well, I guess I have a couple of ideas. I think originally you're absolutely right. More recently, those lines have blurred. We're always taught academic freedom doesn't go as far as we tend to think it goes. I mean, we don't have an absolute right to do in our classes whatever we want. Departments can assign textbooks that we all have to use, which I think is outrageous. I mean, personally, that violates my sense of academic freedom. We do have the right to research whatever we want, and I think that is something that everybody does agree on. But I think over time, we have pushed the boundaries of that traditional academic freedom to more or less migrate into the space reserved also for free speech. But it also works the other way. I mean, free speech in our country only applies to the government. And that means that as a private university, the First Amendment doesn't apply to us explicitly. Now, I would argue it does, because there's Supreme Court cases that argue about public spaces and kind of quasi-public spaces. And I would certainly argue that universities like USD count as that they're the functional equivalent of public space. But the fact of the matter is, we can get away with a lot more restrictions on free speech on our campus than Berkeley can. And so you're right, I mean, they are very different. But unpacking it takes a lot of time and effort, and the boundaries are always changing. But yeah, was there something else that you wanted us to address?
Actually, I don't know if you signed up for this book today, Matt, but it addresses that exact question, and I read through that piece very quickly. But they agree with Dell that academic freedom is very different than free speech.
So for instance, I mean, one of the things that prompted it, right, is when we talk about universities inviting people like Milo Yiannopoulos to campus, it's clear to me how that kind of invitation might be protected by a norm of free speech. It's less clear to me how it might be protected by a norm of academic freedom. Because the whole point of academic freedom is to foster the pursuit of truth.
Yeah.
And it's not all that obvious to me that Milo Yiannopoulos cares at all about the pursuit of truth, right? Or that the pursuit of truth is furthered by inviting that kind of conversation to campus, right? So academic freedom comes with, we're closely tied to the notion of responsibilities, right? So you have the responsibility as an academic to know your stuff, right? And to not speak out on matters that you don't know anything about and claim your academic credentials as backing for that speech. That, you don't get any of that with free speech. And so if academic freedom is what universities are about, that seems to me in some ways to limit and contour the sort of conversations that we're trying to foster, rather than if it's free speech more generally.
Well, personally, I would agree with you on that one, but if a student group, and if we agree that students also have a right of academic freedom on campus, it's not just reserved to professors. If they think that Milo has something worthwhile to say, they ought to have the right to invite them. I mean, we're academics. We all think that all other academics in our field are idiots and not worth listening to. And once you start opening up that door, it leads to trouble, I think. But you're right. Some people just don't have ideas worth listening to.
And this book separates faculty and their responsibility as in the classroom to do exactly what you said, but to actually then be outside of the classroom and to say what they want to say as an individual. Although, and this would go along with your argument, Del, although we're seeing some cases recently where an academic might post something on a Twitter feed and then lose his job, or there was a woman at Portland State who wanted to emphasize race, and so she wore blackface, and she wore a certain coat that linked to a book. She did it at a private party, and at this private party, but she lost her job. So there's still some overlap between free speech and academic freedom, but we usually keep them distinct. But you know that better than anybody. Carmen, and then this woman, and then Eric. Carmen, I saw your hand up a while ago.
I appreciate the conversation really well, and I thank you for saying that this is complicated, Noelle. And
Let's start right here.
and for you raising the $600,000 security cost. And I think that that's a question. What is the cost of freedom of expression in this context? Because what I have seen on college campuses, particularly those that are reconsidering speakers, that they're really moving towards the decision not being the freedom of speech piece, but the cost to provide a safe environment, because violence has been integrated into freedom of speech, that there are individuals and groups that are intentionally creating unsafe context for voice to be heard.
Immediate threat.
Absolute, immediate threat to life and property, both. So what do you think about that relationship to freedom of expression?
One argument is that I'm hoping these are isolated incidents and that we don't have to deal with this as often as we think. But we won't find out until we start to see what those challenges are. That's one thing to say. Del, you were...
I would just add that it's going to have a chilling effect no matter what. I mean, universities are going to tend to shy away from more controversial speakers, and it's just easier to say, no, we're just going to enjoy our quiet campus rather than invite somebody who's going to trigger, not necessarily a violent response, but protests and problems. We've had other events like that, and it's tended to work out, but that's part of the problem too. I think what Noelle said, that it's not just the effects, it's the feared effects. And maybe we just have to be brave. I don't know. Let's see.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for having us. I think I wish it was loaded with students and more faculty and everything, because I think this is a really important discussion. And I know Matt Zwolinski also has debates that he's sponsoring for more controversial, which I attended last year and will continue. I'm a conservative. You're speaking about the Supreme Court protects free speech. I think I'm going to speak not in esoteric terms. I'm going to speak as a person. I've been a psychologist and therapist, so I've worked in the mental health field. I am now in the education field at Souls. I don't think necessarily that I'm worried about the Supreme Court per se. I'm worried about the day-to-day, more local influence on shutting down free speech, because I felt it as a conservative over the past few years. I felt it in the mental health field, practicing in nonprofits. I mean, I dedicated my whole life to working in nonprofits. I'm also seeing it with students. I think there is a definite groupthink that goes on, and yet I get a lot of the messages that there's one way to go about practicing and training mental health professionals, and I know it's there. And I felt intimidated by standing up. I've never stated I was a conservative before, but I'm tired of hiding it, because I don't think I'm a very terrible person or a very hate-filled person, because I may disagree in ideas, never in actions. In 25 years, I worked with every type of individual and never once got any feedback that I would get bias or prejudice, because I don't feel that. I may disagree in some thought processes and ideas. And so I'd like to say, when I read in the Wall Street Journal, the president, the dean of the law school writing an article that was about the professor there, when I see President Harris get on the internet saying the school does not stand for this, when I see the dean at my department saying this is terrible, when there was moaning and gnashing of teeth about Donald Trump, that has a chilling effect. Let me tell you, it is not that easy to be a conservative in California, in San Diego, and at USD. So I would take issue that this is just a Supreme Court protection that we're looking for. We're looking for a community where all ideas are accepted. And it is going to come. The more of these conferences we have, I think it emboldens people to speak up, as I have been. And I worry it could cost me my job if I don't promote certain agendas. So this is from down in the trenches. I am not esoterically discussing ideas. I'm talking about what it's like to be different on the campus of USD. And there is groupthink.
Yeah. So all I was saying is that your speech is legally protected. Yeah. So, but
Right, but
Yeah.
they can say I don't do good
Right.
classes and, blah, blah, blah.
so your sentiment right here is exactly why we are all sitting here having this conversation, and it's why Matt's center was designed as well. It was so that these conversations could be held in a open, civil, theoretical way, and that you would be at a point where you could say exactly how you feel here in this room. So it's delightful for me that you spoke up and that you're making that point clear, and also that you go to Matt's as well. So,
That's why thank you for having me.
yeah.
But I think we need so much more on campuses.
Yeah.
I think there is a whole culture of shutting down what we don't like and disagree with, probably on both sides to some extent. But right now, there is definitely an ascendancy of the left, where the campuses are saying, no, we're not going to allow you to say anything that we disagree with. So, thank you for this.
Anybody?
I'm good.
Eric?
So I'm gonna take a different approach that this debate over speech is about sort of a revisionist self-reflection. Look, you're not fooling anybody. If you take the N-word out of Huckleberry Finn, you are not helping me, right? And so when people say, oh, well, we don't, if someone tells a racist joke and 200 people laugh, the problem is not the person telling the joke, right? The 200 people laugh, which means we still have work to do, but what we do is we focus our attention on telling that person, oh, that was a really horrible joke, you shouldn't tell that joke, that's really bad, you hurt people's feelings. Look, 200 people laughed, which means we still have work to do, right? But if we can say, if we just shut that person up, I mean, this whole thing about sort of not, because people might get offended and those kind of things, I understand that, and I don't think it's a diversity and inclusion issue. I think it is an issue about, we live in a society where if we want these freedoms, it's a give and take, right? You can't, it's not always about what you want, it's about sort of that, it's part of the deal, right? If you want that to occur. So it's interesting to me, especially the whole taking the N-word out of Huckleberry Finn, that somehow trying to scrub out the fact that this is how we used to and still do refer to black people is insulting. And it's not, it's not helping me, right? The same students who are here, because I'm trying to figure, I ask my students this, I go, so when Kendrick Lamar was playing at Coachella, right? He uses the N-word all the time. So when 60,000 predominantly white kids are having that conversation with him and singing the song and shouting back, like what exactly is happening there? What is the interchange that's going on? So I think it seems like we want to hide the fact that we still have work to do. And by doing that, you say, like, if a person is racist and they want to speak and there are people who want to hear them, that means we have work to do, right? It's not like don't let that person speak because if we don't let that person speak, then there is no racism. No, that's not the way that works. And so it's interesting that we do, again, I think it's this sort of revisionist thing where it's like, well, if we don't let these ideas express themselves, then people who have these ideas don't really exist, when in fact they do exist. They just figure out clever ways to exercise those ideas in much more secretive manners. So it's just this weird personal thing with me because I liked Huckleberry Finn just but again, it was removed as a sort of, it's going to make black kids feel better. And I'm not sure if that is the case. Part of it is we have a responsibility to educate people. Like Mike Weller is a very good playwright. if the students didn't understand Lenny Bruce and what maybe they needed to educate themselves about what Mike Weller as playwright was trying to do before they rejected doing the play, right? Just do a little homework and say, well, who is Lenny Bruce and what, speaking of which, we're showing that film later this year. So part of it is this give and take. This is the deal. If we're gonna live in a free society, people are gonna say and do things that we don't like, but I'm sure I may say and do something that people don't like.
Nobody disagrees with you here on this panel. We just say, you need to understand, all I'm saying is you need to understand where they're coming from, but these guys don't
Yeah, I know,
advocate.
I do understand where they're coming from, but
Yeah.
but my point is that by telling certain people they can't speak doesn't mean whatever issue they're speaking about doesn't exist. And that's the frightening part for me, is pretending like by silencing them, there aren't still racists, there aren't still homophobes, there aren't still sexist people, by just saying anyone who has those views can't speak.
I'm gonna call on Mike, but I'm gonna say something really, you go first. Me, then Mike.
Just real quickly, I think Brian was writing down as you were speaking, I think there ought to be another band talk on Huck Finn and the N-word. I would love to hear what you had to say about that.
One thing that's really frightening me is, it was in the Inside Higher Ed this morning, it's articles that are published that are, the publisher is then retracting them because people are offended by what's being published. So there was an article on there was one in the philosophy journal that was about transgender visioning, and then 500 people signed a petition to have that article pulled, rather than deconstruct the article and criticize it and just debunk the entire thing. Today, this article about colonialism that said maybe countries would have been better keeping colonialism, 10,000 people have signed to pull this one, rather than spending the time to debunk it, which is, I think, problematic. Mike is the last question, according to our director, Dr. Clark.
All right. So, Dell, you mentioned this idea of the university being a safe space, and I think, well, you kind of agree to that to some extent.
I actually mean rooms that are like safe spaces, yeah.
So my question is, I've heard from a lot of students who feel like the class, racial, gender privilege that's a bit one-sided out in society as a whole, on campus they feel it here, that while we like to say that we aspire to certain things at the university, their lived experience is one where they feel the same, like how much different are we than society in general? And I guess if that is the case, if that's the lived experience of students, then if we are trying to create a university that is a safe space, doesn't that kind of mean that we have to change the balance a bit, that we need to be doing something where different than what's just happening in society as a whole? I don't know if that made sense. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No,
You go ahead.
please, after you.
No.
I don't know. I'm going to try to answer this question and pull me back if I go too far afield. I did want to address one thing about safe spaces and maybe just kind of define it a little bit as I see it. There's a big difference between the way that I think Noelle defines safe spaces. A safe space as a place to retreat briefly, to think, to reflect, to organize, and to act. That's a safe space I can get behind. But other people define safe space as a place to hide, a bubble where the world can't intrude and hurt you. And that is the definition of safe space that I feel uncomfortable with. And I think that that's how I think of the university. The university, in a way, it's a bubble. It protects you from larger world. We always talk about the ivory tower and the school on the hill. Well, there's a point to that. I think to a degree that's a good thing, because that's where we go to think and retreat and learn and then act. It's not where we go to hide forever unless you're a professor. but that's what that is, I think, what I was thinking about.
That's it. Thank you for coming.